Welcome to the Unfucked podcast. Stuart is founder and head of programming at Elevate in Singapore. He has an MSc Strength and Conditioning and a BSc Strength and Conditioning. He's a competitive weightlifter with an acute technical understanding of biomechanics and athletic development. I met Stuart in 2016 when I was working on Justice League in London. We trained and competed together, and I was humbled many times by his methodical and precise movement and his impressive natural strength. After we finished that job, we moved back to the US, and Stuart and his wife moved to Singapore, where he has been ever since. We've kept in contact here and there, but mostly went our own way, and it has been interesting to see where our worlds collide, despite the distance. When he started posting long-form content on coaching and fitness, I knew it was time to sit down and talk, as we have both developed in very different ways over the past 9 years, but have a lot in common as we have both continued to develop athletes and clients. I admire Stuart's outlook on fitness, and I would say in many ways is very much like my own. We both have a profound love for weightlifting, and we both have bumped up against the limitations of the standard model of training. In this episode, we discuss the role of choosing a platform to highlight our unique way of communicating instead of choosing one based on popularity. We cover the role of storytelling in the skill of coaching, the shift from objective-based training to long-term outlooks, defining strength, and most importantly, how behavior plays a central role in developing ourselves. For more information on Stuart and a link to his long-form content and his Substack, please click the links in the show notes. I hope you enjoy the episode. Without further ado, Stuart Diplock. Welcome to the Unfucked podcast. My name is Michael Blevins. I've been training some of the world's most elite performers for over 15 years, from iconic actors and athletes to soldiers and CEOs. I'm an entrepreneur, an athlete, and an obsessive when it comes to human behavior.
Man looks in the abyss. There's nothing staring back at him. At that moment, man finds his character. And that is what keeps him out of the abyss. I think I understand.
Fitness can obviously appear fairly superficial, right? Like it's not that complex when you look at it, at least from the cultural standpoint. People are just like, I need to get fit, go to the gym for an hour, have a trainer tell you to do some stuff, eat some chicken and rice, and then you're like on your way. And you're like, that's the cultural perception of it means that, you know, I think it does get reduced down to the top 5 exercises, and you need these foods in your diet to super blast belly fat away. And it's like very prone to actually like giving into that, you know, hook reel that everybody is talking about. Like, oh, if you don't have like this 2-second hook, then everything goes away. And you're like, everything that I appreciate about fitness is like hours down the road. You know what I mean? Like the nuances of it are really, were still captivating me. And I know you've been doing this for a while, but like 2 decades now. Yeah. And I have to admit, I'm still very much interested, if not like outright obsessed, not with the industry itself, because that's disillusioning, but with the topic of like how fitness relates to everything. Yeah. So maybe in that context, talk to me a little bit about how you came about using maybe the long form version of Substack. Like what got you writing articles again in long form processing?
So kind of a bit of a mix of things, really. Like the person who prompted me to do it was Naz, my wife. So she runs the social media for our gym, for Elevate. And she's been trying to get me to create content for the gym loads and loads of times. And in marketing for fitness, specifically within, I'll probably get into this a bit later, but Singapore's the fitness industry is quite young and it's still very superficial. So needing that short form content with a hook and all of that. And it just feels so unauthentic to me. And it just didn't feel right. I've always been the person who wanted to apply context to the situation. And I would be having like trouble trying to write just this short little piece for this technique pointer, because I'm like, well, this is only works for this person in this situation. It wouldn't work for this person. So what if they're reading it? They're going to take it the wrong way. And I'd be so worried I end up just not doing it and get like paralysis by analysis because I couldn't go into the depth, and it would just frustrate me. And after a while, she was like, just why don't you lean into that and do long form content? Because we use, for our membership base, we use WhatUp as the platform. And every now and again, I'd post some longer form stuff on there for our members and got some decent response from it, with people wanting to learn more and appreciating a little bit more depth. So it kind of fed into that of, okay, maybe I'll start writing on some topics. I hadn't really written for a while until I then did my master's degree, which forced me to write a lot more with all of the essays and all of the reports, etc., and then the thesis that I had to do. So I got back into the habit of writing. And one of the head lecturer on that course, while we're very scientifically minded, one of his biggest things is he had a hatred for scientific articles being boring to read. So he would really hammer into us that you've got to create a narrative, you've got to create a story, and you've got to make it interesting. So part of the course was teaching you how to write in a more interesting, engaging way while still communicating the more complex topics. So I kind of had a bit of a practice coming out of that, and then thought, nah, why not? What's the harm? And in fact, I actually, like, on my notes on my computer, had sometimes just written topics out, which I had never even really intended to share. I just had ideas and things that popped into my mind that I wanted to almost to consolidate my own thoughts on the topic, writing it out as if I was trying to communicate it to someone else would really help me condense my own thoughts on the area and kind of get more clarity on it. So I had all these things already prepared, already in the notes on my computer. So I was like, well, these are all topics with a little bit of fleshing out could be good articles. So it's more of, okay, let's give it a go, see what happens. I was quite nervous about sharing it at the start, because you never quite know if anyone gives a shit. And if it's gonna, like, just nobody reads them ever. But then I was like, well, why does it matter? Because I've already written them in my notes and nobody's read them, so I might as well share them if a couple of people find some use. And then off the first one, got some pretty decent feedback, and then ended up, so far it's been almost one a week. It gives me something to kind of actually look forward to. People start giving me suggestions on things they would like to learn more on. I then go and kind of think about what my real thoughts are on that topic and maybe dive into it a little bit more, and then try and write something out. So it's kind of a bit of a combination of things which led to it, and generally quite enjoyable actually.
The process, I think the process that you're, I mean, the writing thing just being like kind of a practice of analyzing your own thoughts and taking these things, I think that in itself is what I got addicted to, just because it's so much different than having an opinion based off of your observation and not really refining whether it makes sense or not. And again, I'll go two ways on this, because obviously writing is my like thing, but I also see, you know, it's what form appeals to me, like how somebody can articulate their thought and bring it into story a lot, like you said. And I think that's great that somebody actually was like, you know, this doesn't have to be boring. And I think that's kind of what first started fascinating me about, you know, reading something. There's this author, Murakami, a Japanese novelist. When I was in grade school, like I was complaining to my English teacher about the book we were reading. And I think it was like Black Boy or some kind of like, you know, slavery topic. And, you know, so the language was what it was from the American South. And my argument was like, why would you try to teach me English based off something that is not English, right? Where the rules are not apparent. And, you know, it's just being I would say a kind of like rebellious kid, because it was just a shit book. But he just like took the book from me, and I was like, oh no, I'm going to get in trouble because I'm not necessarily like a good student. And he handed me Murakami, and he was like, this book's for you. And I was like, okay. the first chapter opened, it was the book was called Hard-Boiled Wonderland in the End of the World. And this guy is describing how he counts change in his pocket. And I'm telling you, it was like a page turner. And I got done with that. And I was just like, why would I ever read anything boring again? And it's not like the topic was interesting. It's that it really brought you into the world. And this is, something that took me a really long time to understand after studying it. It was not just the topic of fitness, because I think people, we know like it's there. There's obviously still stuff to be discovered, and we'll get to that. But I think, like, for the most part, it's not that hard to figure out the tenets or the energy systems or how to use fitness to enhance your life. But all of it is such shit. You get like some of the best weightlifting coaches or some of the best sport coaches, and you read their books, and you're like, oh, okay, like you have no way to sell or package your idea. Therefore, they're next to worthless, to be honest.
Yeah.
And this is kind of, have you heard of a guy? His name's Will Storr, a pretty famous author in, I want to say out of the UK, but he wrote a couple different books, and he used to write kind of about screenwriting and the story arc and mythology, kind of the Joseph Campbell topic. Well, he recently came out with this book, and it's really about selling, and you're like, why would I look at that? But in reality, selling is quite literally what we're talking about, which is like, I have this idea and I want somebody else to agree to it. Well, that's selling, right? We're agreeing on the value of the idea in the exchange of it. So he's saying that, humans are very interesting in how they process information, as opposed to, like, there's this term in, I want to say it's German, it's Umwelt. Umwelt is kind of the cursory sensory experience that an animal or a conscious being can interact with the world with. And so, like, obviously, like a bat, echolocation or sound, and a fish is like kind of vibration, and a dog is smell. Well, his argument, since we have like 5 senses that usually become kind of like, become enslaved to our 5 senses, he says there's another thing that people miss, that it's how people interact with the world, and that's through story. Our Umwelt is story. So we can only really process information if we understand the trajectory of an act, right? This first, second, and third act.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Like, just that concept makes a lot of sense, because everything that is sold well has a story behind it. Everything that's popular has a story. All of the brands that are doing well currently are the ones who are storytelling best. So it makes a lot of sense. What was the book called? I'm going to make a note of that.
It's called A Story is a Deal by Will Storr. And to be fair, it's like most pop culture books. There's like, it probably could have been a blog post, but it gets repetitive. But he's a phenomenal writer. He does recover this idea, and it becomes kind of interesting because it threads the exact same thing. It's like, it's almost like, you see competing ideas in the market, right? Like, this would be a great example, having to do with fitness. We like, what the fuck makes High Rocks so captivating to people, right? What is because to us, and to be fair, I've done one, you've done one, arguably, right?
Yeah.
Okay, like, great, that's super fun, actually. Like, I
enjoyed it, but the obsession with it, I still struggle to wrap my head around.
When I was in America, I had a chance to meet the creator of it. She was actually training. You probably, we used to go to this gym all the time, CrossFit Mallorca. Now it's called Choice Training Club. Well, they were like one of the first. Rob was like one of the first to really like dive headfirst into High Rocks. I don't know what he saw, because when he was talking about it, and I was like, really? It's just like, it seems like remedial fitness to me, expressed at a high degree. No offense to anybody that like does it, but it just seems kind of weird given the context. And then I went down there and I saw the story that they were like threading together. And that was really, oh man, they have weaved in something that is, here's the weird part, is like, I think they weaved in the arc of a hero, but they've made it accessible to the average person.
Yeah. The accessibility, something I've noticed with the members at our gym and the population in Singapore specifically, and Asia, where it's really taken off. Like, it's ridiculous over here of how popular that has become. As in, like, the Singaporean government actually subsidized Hyrox to take over the national stadium because it brings so much tourism in, and they put a lot of money into it. It's people who didn't play competitive sport much when they were growing up, and now they've been given this outlet to almost live their childhood dream of being an athlete, and they're told that they're an athlete, they get to behave like an athlete, and they get to experience that, like, the enjoyment of doing something athletic, which is great. Like, we remember when we were competing all the time, there's so much enjoyment in that, there's so much drive behind that, but without really needing to have the genetic skill set of being a weapon to play high level sport. Without having to put that much training in, they can live a pretty normal corporate life alongside it because it's so accessible. It gives them all of the taste of being an athlete without having to make most of the sacrifices.
Yeah, that's probably a really great way to put it. It's almost like, and again, I actually really enjoy it. I respect their marketing for it. I respect the explosion of it because I'm not one of those people that thinks that fitness has to be done my way. Like, I do appreciate almost all forms of it. I don't care how people are interested in it. So when I say this, I mean it like it really is kind of like cosplay for athleticism, right? Like to a large degree, because there is no barrier to entry. It's just there's still effort. You still have to finish it, or you still have to partake. Which is
it's not easy to complete. It's still a challenge, and I think I agree with you completely there. Like, over here, it's got a lot of people into doing fitness and doing activity who weren't doing it previously. So net positive, massive. You're getting companies who are supporting their employees to go and do it as a corporate health and kind of social thing to do. So it's getting people moving who never would have done an activity, or the most they were doing was a walk, which was meant to be like a 5K run, and they just walk it with their friends. So it's getting people moving. It's almost like again, it starts being kind of what CrossFit was, which was a good gateway for people to experience different types of fitness and get into it more.
Yeah, and this really has to do, interesting enough, I think my compassion for people that, have just not been interested enough or captivated enough in the story of fitness, that something pings off and suddenly they go, oh, actually, I would like to experience that. I go, like, super commendable. And honestly, I'm looking at it from my perspective being like, what are they doing right? Like, how are they communicating the idea of, let's just say, like, hard work, or competing or challenging yourself physically, and taking a time period to prepare yourself accurately. And in order to do that, you really have to be introspective. You're like, how are they doing it? How are they packaging? What's the story arc? Like, what is the selling thing doing, so that we can like better understand how to deliver what topics we're writing about? Because arguably you and I are in the weeds. Like, I'm so absolutely disconnected from the average person, right? Similarly, and I do have to acknowledge that, because like that's not the person I'm generally talking to. That's not my audience. The subjects I go into and the way that I look at fitness, I think, is accessible to a beginner. That it might be inherently very curious, but you almost have to have had done something to maybe know what I'm talking about, right? There's these sensations that come up that I think are prerequisites or gatekeepers to the eventual like interest in fitness. And I would say, like, to me, man, I didn't get it. I imagine you came from maybe a sporting background, team sports, stuff like that.
Yeah, so rugby first, and then weightlifting. So pretty competitive, but I think I was actually having that kind of conversation with my business partner, Dylan, about, like, I feel for people to get to that point of really looking into fitness on a deeper level, you almost have to have overdone it elsewhere. Right. So we're in the same boat with just like pushing ourselves competitively in functional fitness to the point of our body basically being like, we've had enough, you need to stop this. And then you almost come out the other side and you're like, well, there's more to this. There's like, now I've stopped doing the competitive side of things, and I'm not prepping towards this specific date. But I want to do these things still. I know this is good for me. I know I want to do it. I find so much joy from it. But if it's not I kind of had that real moment when I decided to stop weightlifting. That kind of like, who am I moment, when like that's what I'd been for. I've been a competitive athlete since I was 15. I was probably 28 when I was like, okay, like got to start focusing on career a little bit more. After the weightlifting thing was like, yeah, it was not giving me what it was. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze when I couldn't demonstrate a lunge in class because my patella tendons hurt too much. And I was like, nah, this is time to move on a bit, time to grow up. But then it was a real period of time of trying to figure out, okay, what do I do? Why do I do this? I did a bit of bodybuilding, which I actually like really learned a lot from and really enjoyed that process of like moving from task completion to being really focused on what I'm trying to get out of that specific activity. And that, because weightlifting and CrossFit is very task completion orientated. It was just like, pick this barbell up, put it here. Like, as long as it's gradually getting heavier in weight, then you're doing it right. Whereas bodybuilding was more slowing it down, thinking about what I'm trying to achieve from that task, what I'm actually trying to get out of it. But I'd never really taken the time to focus on that before. And that was quite a enjoyable experience.
Yeah, that's kind of, I mean, it's really interesting once you change from objective to subjective kind of, it's very loose, a loose destination still, I would say, but that does lead to kind of a different approach to it. I think you're right. Like, man, the identity thing is very real. And I think, you know, we see this in other athletes. Obviously, you've worked with, you know, probably professional athletes, at least in the same categories or whatnot. And it makes total sense once you actually put it together. But anybody looking from the outside sees this as such a ridiculous premise to identity. But when you really shape it together, I think this is kind of like to bring it back around, like how I look at fitness now is quite literally kind of the physiological threads that start to change how we feel and change how we think about things. Now, when we pick it up in grade school, which I didn't, I started skateboarding and doing martial arts, but it was not competitive. I didn't start getting competitive until I was like, kind of like in my 20s, looking to like prove that how I was training was like being, you know, effective. And I was like able to put things together. And it really wasn't out of a sense of, I wanted to compete and show that I was the best. It really had to do with like, well, I want to take my practice to the next level. And I think that would really push me in the right direction. And then I got thrown into a world that was not, you know, I would say not really of my choosing, but really dragged into something where I was just enamored with the concept of it. But having kind of like been a late starter, it might have been what maybe I was able to see the different identities, because, you know, the first real competitive sport I got into, I would say, was triathlon, and then cycling. And then I came back to weightlifting, and then CrossFit, and then jiu-jitsu, and then back into martial. It's been like this, you know, visceral cycle of coming into different things. And it's funny because whenever you whenever you kind of like arrive into a group and the gatekeepers or whatever, you start picking up the identity cues before you get the physical attributes. So the dumb things in triathlon are like, you know, did you have the compression socks? So you're like, you know, did you shave your legs? You're like, do you have the right kit? You know, what does your bike setup look like? And so you can kind of purchase these symbols of identity. And I think that's what roots most people. And then, you know, switching kind of stages, you know, going to cycling. Cycling is like, man, you want to talk about this nuanced identity attached to what I would call the art of suffering is insane. So they have this thing where, you know, if you have hard tan lines in your legs, you're a cyclist, right? Like that means that what that presupposes is that every minute I spend in the sun, I have these spandex shorts on, and that allows for this crisp line of a tan, or there's no demarcation between my tan and my white ass winter legs. And that is a sign of like what they call a hard man. And that comes from like a reference to the old 70s cyclists that would just do these insane efforts, the classics and whatnot. And then it really has to do with like, I mean, we're talking whether the glasses go on the outside of your straps of your helmet or inside, and how high the length of sock goes. And you have this very like clean aesthetic, which I appreciate, to be fair. I appreciate the amount of detail that goes into it. But a lot of the time you're like, then what's that fat dentist who has a $20,000 rig doing here? Because the real identity to cycling is 2 pounds per inch. That's the real identity, right? Like if you're 6 foot, you're 150 pounds, that's it. Because if you're not that light, you don't go fast. And therefore that was like, how I proudly say I developed kind of one of my first eating disorders, and I would call it ordered. I don't think of it as a mental disease, because I was actually just very controlled with my diet, but me trying to get down to 170 pounds at 6'2", and that's where, I crashed, wrecked, destroyed my elbow, and basically had to reconsider, like, I'm not even getting paid for this.
Like, what am I doing?
Yeah, what is this? And then, that loss of identity, like you talked about, was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm still looking for something. Like, I'm still looking to be maybe appreciated, or I'm still looking for this, like, I want to belong to a culture and be respected. And that, okay, as long as I understand this becomes a conscious choice. And that directed me to, well, what are the aspects that I want to be respected for? And that's where I came to, you've talked about this as, in your article on behavior traits. This is really what led to the first kind of concept of me seeing behavior, a trait linked to kind of the activity we're involved in. And it really had to do with like looking at how athletes in endurance sports tend to be versus how athletes in CrossFit tend to be. Like, to be fair, like, they in jiu-jitsu and like the whole gambit, and I've seen there's a spectrum here that just makes sense to me, where I get like, an unbalanced, I call them unbalanced athletes, right? Let's presuppose, you don't have to agree with this, but I suppose that humans are like the most general athlete in the animal kingdom, right? We have this ability. Yeah, we have an ability to also like gear our training to build attributes that are deficiencies. And this leads also to what I would talk about the Soviets, really discovering, which is GPP is the foundation of everything. And when you miss that, you really mess up an athlete. But for sport at a world-class level, we really have to look at, what are the behaviors required to win the sport, and then the underlying mechanisms. And what I found was, like, just as a like contextual note, everybody's going to get mad at me for this. If ultra athletes tend to be very unbalanced, but they exhibit traits that are also unbalanced. So this is a weird one, but they tend to be more cynical. They tend to not trust people. This is and they're very like lone wolves. On the opposite side of it, you have like CrossFit tend to be very communal, but very like ADHD, like they're very like, they can't keep track of their thoughts. They're very busy bodies. They have kind of this running mental loop that's happening. And to be fair, you see a lot of autism in jiu-jitsu because of the innate problem solving that's attached to it. So there's behavior traits that are attracted to a sport, and then there's behavior traits that are developed by a sport. And so I kind of set out on like, I want to figure this out. This is like so bizarre to me. So that's really what has driven me the past, I would say, 7 to 10 years, has been like, just this isn't about the heaviest weight lifted. This isn't about the shiniest abs. This really is kind of a precursor for how we want to approach the world, if that makes sense.
It was for me, it was a kind of observation. Started with just observations on groups of people I was coaching, and just kind of why could certain people just push through more discomfort than others when they weren't physiologically superior, and then other people who were physiologically had the necessities to do that thing. Why couldn't they do that thing? Why couldn't they suffer in that particular task? It was a bit of a realization in myself as well. Like I used my CrossFit career, like why could I tolerate a 3-minute suffer fest and put myself in an absolute hole in that? But if you asked me to do a 20-minute row, I would bitch out at 10 minutes. Like, why was that? Like, if just tolerating discomfort was just tolerating discomfort, then that would carry over. Why can I do certain domains, not others? Why was I so confident approaching a heavy barbell with no fear to it, but can't sleep the night before I've got a 60-minute assault bike test? So it was that kind of seeing it in myself and just being curious of that, and then seeing it in other people as well. And then coming across your writings on it and some conversations you had on your podcast, actually, and then kind of thinking along those similar lines of just, this is really fascinating about, at first, seeing the different camps that people kind of gravitate towards, and then being okay, then if the people naturally gravitate towards those, can you take that person from that group, put them in this one, and will they develop that? So it's like, I've been trying that with myself. I've moved towards some more endurance training, which, you know me from meeting me 10 years ago, was never the strong point. So trying to develop those and just having those moments of sitting with discomfort and the mental battle of just continuing and just repeatedly telling yourself, like, no, we're going to continue. I want to stop, but I'm going to continue. And seeing if it's developing because it gets easier because I get fitter, or do you still have those same conversations with yourself every single time, and therefore you're developing a trait instead?
I'd hate to spoiler alert this to anybody, but you're like, the conversation is always there, and that is kind of the you do go faster. Beauty. Right? You do go longer, you do lift heavier, but essentially we're just moving the line at which the conversation does happen. And that's this internal dichotomy that I think, not very, okay, I don't agree that the general sportsman is an idiot, but the public perception is that like athletes become athletes because they're too dumb to do like other professions. But I would look at it like quite a bit differently. I would say that they notice something in their activity making them feel a certain way long before other people recognize that same thing. And that sensation, that feeling, that sensitivity towards what is happening internally is what then gives drive to developing the things that we would call talent or, a disposition towards a certain sport. It's really just an amount of awareness that we can like connect internally in order to express a certain trait. And you see that, like, you see a kid at 3, 4, 5 bouncing a tennis ball or throwing it against the wall, and they're building these motor units of that have everything to do with maybe not even tennis, but coordination, dexterity, like all of these things where they're relating their body, their physical attributes to how it interacts with the world, and they're building this very insane map. And then you see kids who are not that, who maybe they're driven towards books and academia or any of these things, and sometimes you get a blend. It's not this or the other, but you do see a very determined split. And essentially how I look at it now is there is something inherent in the way you move that triggers how you feel, and that triggers the thought. Now, if you break this apart, the Western approach to psychology is the opposite. What we're talking about is actually a very Eastern embedded thought, right? So when they believe like, and there's a lot of truth to this just based off of like how the neurons develop, but essentially they develop from the gut first, right? And that is what Eastern thought would say your being is. So like a lot of the Vedas and the Upanishads will describe that you have this energy in your gut, or like your, it's where you are. And if you watch a kind of like child develop, they're very much just into the moment, and they're very like tactile, and they're feeling things and interacting with it because they don't really have an ability to process information in the neocortex yet. So then you watch a child develop, and the next neurons that really develop are kind of around the heart. Like the amount of neurons in the stomach and heart are exponentially kind of, I would say growth pattern wise, they're like much higher than the brain. And you see toddlers throwing these kind of emotional fits. And I say around the heart, not relating the physical heart to like the emotional complex, but you get what I'm saying. Like the heart center is generally how we think of this. This really maps the Eastern, if they look at their chakras and how they believe the energy moves up and through, it's really tracking that then toddlers are just hyper emotional because all of these new sensories are coming in and they're trying to deal with them. And then eventually, once they can articulate words and logic, we really move people into the head. We tell them, don't be stupid, be logical, think about this, be very, rote in your memorization and your sequencing. And then we stop. Right. So like once you get to essentially the epitome of like, I'm smart, I'm an intelligent human being, we're very much taught to approach the world from the top down, which is like, think about it first, don't let emotions override you. And the intuition thing is mostly like, it's woo to most people, right? It's like this inner sense that we can't really describe, but we know there's something going on. Well, in the Eastern tradition, once they know that people get into the mind, they know that they're trapped there and they try to bring them back down through meditation and yoga and all of the, the martial arts really have to do with being and feeling and whatnot. So
that's actually like an interesting, I'll just bring up there, like being over in the East and being in a country which is 60% Chinese descent and coaching a sport such as weightlifting. There is such a dichotomy between how Western coaches coach and Eastern coaches coach. So Chinese coaches, they don't give external cues. Everything is internal. It's all a feeling. And it's all about finding the right feeling. And it takes so much longer to achieve like a base level, but their mastery ends up being so much greater. It's just really interesting you said that.
Where did you first when did you first recognize that, and like what was the dive into the details of that? That's fascinating.
So in fact, when I first moved to Singapore, there was maybe only one other weightlifting coach here who was an ex-Chinese national team coach, and he did almost all of the coaching for anyone who wanted to weightlift in Singapore. And there was quite a lot of expats in Singapore, Australian, British, American, who just really struggled with being taught in a way which was all about sensation and feeling and connecting, rather than, and they should be frustrated with it, like, can you just tell me what to do? And I ended up getting quite a lot of business from that because I come from that very like British weightlifting. This is the technical model. This is the cue, very external. And then that's what you build the foundation with. And then you worry about the internal stuff and the feeling later. So it kind of ended up bringing me quite a lot of business at the time. And it was then seeing his really good success with a few athletes who he brought from not knowing how to move a barbell to being really, really good weightlifters through just a completely different style to what I was used to. And a lot of them, like one of them we worked with at the gym, and he would teach weightlifting, and he would get so frustrated teaching a lot of people from the Western world because there's like not even the right word to translate it from Chinese to English. So trying to communicate it and get people to understand the feeling they're looking for. And they are just getting frustrated. Like, can you just tell me what to do? I want a solution to this problem right now. And I want it to be a cue because they're just so used to the learning styles being so different. And it was just a really interesting, it's not right or wrong. It just seems to work for people who understand that and understand that they're looking for a feeling. And it was actually, I don't know him personally, but I know of him, the guy who was strength and conditioning coach for Team China weightlifting. And he actually posted 2 days ago saying that like they never responded to an external cue. Everything had to be internal.
That's so fascinating because I've just been watching a video. I think they're interviewing Tian Tao, and it's on Lu Zhangjiao's channel. And you're like, there's something to be said. He was talking about just his perception of ability, right? And it really had nothing to do with the mechanical Western mind, which is like, this is kind of, if anybody had any clue as to how important your framework for reality is on whatever you do in the world, when you start intermingling in cultures, you really see the different approach, right? And language is like the first thing that I look at from cultures that like develop sports. I look at how they rank language into how they teach things. And I noticed something very, very similar, because I imagine like you would see the same thing being in the East, but I saw it when I was in Hungary and in Bulgaria. You know, I saw in Hungary, they teach this concept called összpontosít, in which means like it translates to focus. Like, oh, you got to focus, right? And every American would be like, yeah, I get it. And you're like, that isn't what the word means. The word means all points come to one. And you're like, that is such a different physical aspect of attention, rather than we're usually trying to tunnel our way, as opposed to bring things around to a singular point. And I think this is what fascinates me about, you know, getting back into like thinking about where these things come from. Can we rearrange? The big question for me is, can we rearrange our structure and model of what is happening in order to get better outcomes from it? Because arguably we've adopted so much inherently that we don't understand, or we have a difference of objective. And like you were saying, like, you know, the objective difference being, you know, weight on a bar or speed within a combination of exercises. Once that objective leaves, you have to kind of re-understand a subjective nature. And physical expression, I think that my biggest problem with the model that we have, I think the biggest problem that we have is that it is so objective based that we lose the script, right? Like it's about winning medals, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like I will talk about this just being a problem, because the average person sees the expression of fitness as only related to a sport. And I think that is the big problem. Like, I think that's where they think in order to do X, you have to do Y. And if you're familiar with this term, this kind of switched it for me. There's this word, autotelic, which is like a Greek word that means for the sake of, right? So like, essentially I'm doing something for the sake of doing it. And there's an amateurish love of an activity that is without boundary. And I think this is actually a very Eastern concept, which is like, you know, a Western person sits down to meditate and they get frustrated because they're not going anywhere. And in the East, they're like, no, the point is to go nowhere. And it's like, I think we do a lot of, and I have to overwrite this myself, so I talk about it quite a bit, which is like, we have been indoctrinated to hustle and achieve and make the next level and lift the heavier weight, go the faster speed. And then once we get to the pinnacle of that, the identity goes away, because I'm no longer proving myself on my ability to quote unquote progress. And this is something that I've been like discovering lately, as this cycle of, you know, this is what I think this is fascinating, which is like, you know, periodization, block periodization, all these things are like the tenets of sport development or skill development or physical development, except they're not real, right? Like linear periodization was proven to be very ineffective, you know, as soon as, you know, Metlev and Verkhochansky and these sorts of scientists were like, oh, this doesn't work anymore. And that's because you don't really have this graphable line to progress. Biological adaptation really hijacks that. So I think what really turned the corner for me, and coming from, you know, I weightlifted in Bulgaria, which was an insane experience. I had this lady, a body worker named Stoya. He was like, oh, my girlfriend weightlifts, because he's like watching me in the gym, and he was feeling, funny enough, he felt my traps, and he was like, oh, you're a weightlifter. And I was like, yeah, I lift weights. And he's like, no, like snatch and clean and jerk. And I was like, yeah, I'm like obsessed with those. And he was like, yeah, I can tell the tissue has a quality to it. I totally ignored that and just went, man, what a weird dude. But he could tell by touching my muscle to see like the quality of tissue. It was related to the explosive, obviously, like lifts. And he was like, oh, my girlfriend's a weightlifter. And I was like, oh, that's cool. She just do it for fun. He's like, no, she's the 63 kilo world champion. And I was like, what? And I was like, can I
does
learn
some
from her?
weightlifting.
Yeah. And I was like, can I learn from her? And he's like, she doesn't speak any English. I was like, I don't care. Like, I just, so she came into a session into the gym that we had set up in Bulgaria. And she was like, literally the only thing she knew how to say was too slow. You're too slow, too slow. And I was, at the time, I was really struggling to like snatch my body weight, which is like 205 something. You know, I could get it every once in a while. She was like, what's your like max? And I was like 205. And so I like put it on in pounds, because we shipped all our weights there. So they weren't in kilos. But like 92 or something like that. And so I load up the bar and I like miss it. And she's like, well, yeah, you'll never get that. You're too slow. And she just said too slow. But she was just like, yeah. And so she grabbed it, she picked it up, and she goes fast. And from a hang, she did 5 power hang snatches. And she probably only weighed 70 kilos, right? She's about, you know, her like fighting weight was like 63 kilos. But I just watched her do a set of 5, and I watched the speed off of the bar, and I was like, I do not understand anything about how you're generating that much power. But that concept of coming from, you know, I started really looking into like Bulgarian methodology, which is, you know, Abdujev. Nobody gets into weightlifting without understanding the Bulgarian influence on it. And that will lead you back to the Soviet system. So this is the really weird part, because it took years to really send this home, which was like, the objective of the Soviet system is so much different than what we try to do with sport, except we use all of their methodology and model. And you go, realistically, when we look at it, this drives me crazy to this day, is like, if a 60-year-old lady comes into you and she's like, I need to get stronger, we're like 5x5s, or, you know, like there's some kind of like notion at some point where we need to increase their, you know, we define strength by, you know, the maximum contractile force in this, you know, movement or expression. And so we like put people through these exercises, and we basically, you know, block periodize them up to a artificial peak without any of the other concepts involved. And realistically, when you look at it, first of all, the proletariat was not concerned with the health and longevity of the individual that was into the system, right?
No, I think it was shit. It's been a really interesting like journey for me, coming from like straight from school to undergraduate in strength and conditioning science, which is just periodization models, physiology, biomechanics, studying physiology and biomechanics for sports performance. And it was just all about like year-long plans, macro, meso, micro, just progress towards. And I love it because it fascinates me. But then I never really worked with that many athletes. I then moved into general population people. And there was just a really large period of my career where I was doing what I knew to be right, but it didn't feel right. Because people were getting results, but they wouldn't keep the results. They would get strong, then they would obviously go quite strong, because how I defined strong at the time was how much you squat, and deadlift, and etc. And then they would decide they wanted to work on something else, or we go, oh, we need to do some more cardiovascular fitness, and then that drops down, this one goes up, and it was just constantly doing this. And it was like, okay, you never actually, like, if you're training towards this goal, which never arrives because you're not doing a competition, most of the time when you're building towards a competition, you're nowhere near fitness, because fatigue masks your fitness, you feel like shit, all your other qualities are poor, and it just didn't feel right. And it was a real realization after a while of like, hey, like none of these concepts are wrong, just going about it the wrong way. And can I find a way of helping people be pretty competent all of the time, feel good most of the time, and gradually progress in everything they want to? And what does fitness mean to them as an individual, rather than what have I put on them of, okay, yeah, this is what strength means. It's okay, but what does strength mean to this person, when it actually just means like, I don't want my back to hurt when I pick my grandkid up. They don't give a shit how much they deadlift. So it took like, honestly, in reflection, a worrying amount of time for me to kind of transition that mentally, because it just, all of my education was just that.
Yeah.
And it was, and partly, I think when I moved to Indonesia, I was very lucky to train with the Indonesian weightlifting team, who are like some of the best in the world now.
Yeah.
Multiple world champions, Olympians. And It was speaking to them, watching them be the best in the world, and having no idea about programming progressions, periodization, nutrition, nothing. They just like, okay, you finished your snatch and clean jerk. We'll do some squats now. Okay, how many reps? I will do 5 today. And it's just like, there's not a thought behind it, but there's not like a year-long plan written down where they're building you through phases. It's like, your legs aren't strong enough, so we're just going to do some squats. And that's the extent to which of the thought process behind it. And they've got, like, I was there with, at the time it was Echo, who was like, was he 62 kilos, snatching 142 kilos. And we did national championships there because Naz competed, and they go outside after weigh-in and eat food from a food cart on the side of the road. And he's an Olympian. Like, gold at the time, he was silver medalist at the Olympics and world champion. And Naz, who'd done the competition, had some oats meal prepped. She was like, I'm too embarrassed to eat these. I'm going to eat the food cart food too. Because it's just like it. And it was like, wait, what are we like? We're just doing this all wrong. Like, is there more to this? So it was, it took a long time to have those thoughts and like to change your mind on it when you've just kind of, and like you said, nothing, it's not incorrect.
No,
it's just put in the wrong context on the wrong people. And everything is taken from professional sport and then just applied to general population.
Yeah, just reduced down. It's almost like the worst MLM ever, right? So it's the worst like Ponzi scheme that we've had, which is, again, it's not wrong. It's just conceptually wrong. So I like all models are wrong. Some are useful. Has helped me really like bridge the gap to know like, well, how is my question is always, especially when somebody's like, has a format for whatever they're doing. It's like, who's it for? Who wrote the rules? And what are you trying to achieve? And realistically, here's what dumbfounds me, because I agree, the Soviet system basically advanced us like 2,000 years, right? Like there's this time period. You have like, Chinese scrolls depicting weightlifting for soldiers in maybe 2500 BC. And then you have kind of similar thing at the tombs of Beni Hassan, which are, mostly wrestling, but there's also like, it looks like maybe what looks like the first clean and jerk with a sandbag or some kind of weighted implement, and mostly wrestling. And then you have kind of the Greek tradition. In between there, you have something really interesting. It's called the Kolki Halls of War Horse Training. So this is like 1500. I'll probably get that date wrong, and then people will like scream it because I got like my history wrong. But there's like somewhere in between there, we see kind of even before humans, we see the first cuneiform. It's describing a 270-day training regime for horses, and it's very specific. And when you look at it, you go, oh, periodization, right? Yeah. And then and they have like nutrition and hydration planned out too. They're like, take water away from the horse on this day, and then refeed him and give him more grass on this day. And then, a long walk. So you have like the endurance system, and then we have sprinting. And then you have like this, it's a GPP program for horses. And that's almost 3,000 years ago. It's like incredibly how old this is. And then we don't really see anything in the development or the written form until you really get into like Greek mythology and Greek philosophy, and then we start seeing like, man, they know a lot about it. And then we get like Milo from Croton. What Milo was doing, with a bull was essentially, that was figured out a long time ago. My reasoning is like, you basically have like pick up heavy shit, get stronger, up until the Soviets are kind of like, no, there has to be another method to this. We're looking, and the purpose behind it is wild. We're like, we're not at war, but we need to prove that we're the best country in the world. Like, this is an active war, actually. It's just through sport. And this is the real representation of sport. It is a war machine. And much like the same way that we give children over to fight wars for the elderly on cases of like oil and territory, we're doing the same in the case of giving our children over into a machine that are supposed to like perform on a big stage. the cycling method for the Soviet system, the USMC, is like literally insane. They're pulling millions of people in and selecting 2 or 3 once they get through the system. So we see these 2 or 3 people, and the Western, and arguably, what was that? I think it was like 284 world championships, gold medals, something like that. Since the Soviet machine started competing in, I want to say it was like the Helsinki, the 52 games or something like that. That it was like peak, obviously going to be like Cold War era fighting, Western civilization through the expression of sport. So now that we understand the context, we understand like, well, what were they developing? And they were like, man, they were really discovering 2 major concepts about specificity, the SAID principle, which is like, the thing that you'll learn. And the other thing that we just kind of shoved under the carpet, which is talk about accommodation, unless you're like at the peak experience of a world-class athlete and you're trying to stave off accommodation in order for them to like peak at a higher rate. Yeah. But those are the 2 like major discoveries, and everything under that. And then obviously the shock method, where we're like, looking at, the plyo effect of tendon, connective tissue, and muscular tissue. And these are really the principles that they ran with. Here's what's weird. We love that. We looked at them on stage and we go, what do they do? They're obviously doing something right. So we adopted all of the structure, like you're saying. You're like, periodization, here's the schedule, here's the like 100-day chart of what this athlete should do. But then when you really go back and look at how the coach, Abdijev, any of these guys work, on the day, they're like, do a set of 3. Now it looks like shit. Put it away and go home. Right? And then, lift this. Okay, go do 2 more sets, or add 5 pounds, or 5 kilos, or whatever. Go up and they're like, okay, it's looking slow. Cut it, go home and rest. Come back later in the day, work up to a soft max. Okay. When we look at what the plan was, it wasn't a plan. It was a very, I would say, very detailed, sensitized nervous system to watching the adaptation to the exercises and in the actual desire to like perform at a certain level. And when you take that program and you make somebody else do it, you're basically forcing kind of like a square peg through a round hole kind of deal. And the body doesn't really work like that. And that, like, biology is not forced through certain things. It's cultivated into certain growth periods. And I think that is like the big difference. The big thing that I look at, and this is kind of, I can't believe it took me so long to understand it. And I'll tell you where it came from, because it's just really weird. I was watching on Twitter a bunch of who I respect, some of the best coaches that I think are in the like Western world. They're arguing about the definition of general physical preparedness. And none of them could come up with a definition for GPP. So therefore, they basically claimed that it didn't exist because they couldn't define it in terms of SPP. And really, when you look at the Soviet program, there were 2 programs. You had 10 years of GPP in order to get athletes up to a certain point. Now, we focused on the SPP, special, sport specific adaptation and performance. We apply that to our athletes, but we're missing the entire 10-year base of like, priming the system, making sure they generally have the capacity to move, the flexibility, the range of motion. Most of the thought process in the Soviet system was like, we need the highest general level of preparation before we even make them pick up a bar or get on the rings or do something specific for the sport. And I wonder how we lost that message, right? How did that get so overwhelmingly buried in kind of the minutia? And I think it's just arrogance, right? It's just ego. It's just, I need to express this lift at the most that I possibly can.
And as fast as possible. I think that's another, again, a Western tenet, which I have noticed from being here, is that, like, again, it's more, you see it in the Chinese methodology of like, you always have to, I mean, they do the same. It's kids start at a certain age. You'll spend a year with a PVC pipe or a bit of wood until you've developed this skill set, and then you're allowed to do this. There's no like, we need this and we need it as fast as possible. It's, you'll move on when it's right to move on. You have to earn the right to move on. So it's like the process seems to be more important. Whereas I feel in Western world, it's outcome and as fast as possible. And again, it's for the outcome with no regard for what happens to the athletes in the long run. I don't know if you've ever heard of the with GB rowing and their training camp called UT2, where basically it's the camp where they select the Olympic team, and it's just
gotcha. Yeah, okay.
It's just break people. It's whoever survives that is on the Olympic team. Most people don't survive it. Maybe they come back next year, or they never row again because they hate it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that's almost like and it's kind of celebrated of like this grueling thing. And it's just, when you think about it, it's quite interesting that like, I wonder how many potentially world-class rowers, best of all time, are in that group who just broke because you couldn't find or didn't want to find what worked for them, or give them the time to build a foundation first. It was just, but you don't fit this system. So
to be fair, I would say when you look at like American sport, you're essentially describing football, right? Like which is like take these. This is really wild too, because in any other sport that I've ever been involved with, you want the athlete to remain as small as possible for as long as possible so that they can develop maturity, instead of like then going up weight class sports, I should say, right? Like even in rowing, you want to be under 165.
You max out your category first.
Yeah, exactly. And in America, we take kids that are 15 and 16, and we tell them to drink a gallon of milk today and eat a loaf of peanut butter jelly sandwiches, because if they're not like 300 pounds by the time they're in high school, that they have no chance of making it to the pros. So that they're underdeveloped and they're specialized very, very quickly, which is, you see the kind of butter churner that is American sport.
Yeah, early specialization is a huge issue. A huge issue. I think actually UK is doing pretty well with that. Like there's a lot of people out there being very good with in the schooling system and education, of understanding that like general preparedness or general skill sets for kids leads to better outcomes. Over here in Singapore, not so good, because there's a lot of schools who offer sports scholarships, and schooling is incredibly expensive out here, similar to the US. Yeah. So parents will go, I'm going to specialize my kid in tennis because they will save me $250,000.
That's really interesting. That incentive model is really what's shaping how we view sport. And this is kind of, we do get, parents here who, man, they want their kid to make it. And I always have to talk to parents, because they bring me somebody who's like 12, 13, and, they want to learn something that will help them. And I deal with this jiu-jitsu too. We get young kids in jiu-jitsu because the sport is blowing up, and these kids, they've been doing jiu-jitsu since they were 4 and 5, which is a highly specialized sport. Yeah. And now they're like, okay, now I'm 17. Now I want to go pro. And you're like, you need to like chill the fuck out. Yeah. And talking to the parents about it, they're like, well, what would you do? And I was like, I would pull them and make them do other things, right? Yeah. Play soccer and develop them. And, the reason being is like, man, if somebody comes, my usual explanation is like, we have basketball and football, but I usually take like basketball as the example. You're like, who's the greatest player of all time? I'm like, Michael Jordan. It's like hands down, Michael Jordan. He's the greatest. He's the GOAT. Okay. What was he doing at 17? And they're like, playing basketball. I was like, no, he was fucking around with baseball. He did not give a shit. He didn't even pick up a basketball until he was like 17, 18. And then he started. And you're like, and he's the greatest who ever has been. So what makes you think that if the best who has ever done it is doing it differently than you want your kid to do it? Now, we have a lot of data on specialization and how it harms kids, because you're not able to build correct patterns by generalizing long enough. But to bring this into like kind of the fold for like the average person, because I don't really, again, care about sport necessarily. Like it's interesting. I say that, and we like work with basketball players and whatnot. So I don't want to like think that I don't care about it, but I think about it very, very differently at that level. For the general population, I think they're taking these concepts of high specialty, and then they're running them into, their, first potential peak. And then they get really frustrated because it falls off and there's nowhere else to gain. But you're right, man. When I picked up a barbell for the first time, I was like, I want to get as strong as possible, as fast as possible. I want to see how I can max this thing out, as opposed to, and I use this as the analogy a lot, like if you had 10 minutes to build a structure out of popsicle sticks, right? It would look a certain way and you would do your best. And if you looked at that structure, I'd be then like, hey, like, what if I gave you like an hour? Would it look the same? You'd be like, no, probably not. You'd probably rearrange it. Like, what if I gave you a year? And you're like, well, fuck, then it would, now we're talking like complex architectural concepts used with popsicle sticks. If I give you 10 years, we're talking about something that is completely different, right? So a lot of the times when you ask people, hey, when do you want to get fit? They're like, next week, like this summer, this whatever.
That's just the issue flat out with the industry, full stop, right? It's I think when I came out of CrossFit, I moved into the more personal training space. And that is just I just dislike it to my core of the transformations and we're going to go 12 weeks to get you as shredded as possible. And we just had like large dealings with people who have just come out of those things just so disenfranchised with fitness, terrible relationship with food and exercise. And it's just all because everything needs to happen now. And I feel, especially here with like Singapore being a very affluent place, and people we work mostly with are very used to a transactional experience of I give you my card and you give me the thing. And it's usually very quick, and trying to have that like deeper thought and have the conversation with them. It always amazes me when we have consults with clients and nobody's ever asked them why they do fitness in the first place. It's just immediately into, this is how we can get you to lose body fat. This is how much we can get you, how quickly we can get you to gain muscle mass. There's no like deeper question of why do you even bother doing it? And it all just comes down to how quickly can we do these things? And these are the things you should care about, but it's being told to you by someone else.
Yeah.
I think that
this aligns, like, I mean, this is what makes me land on what I would call sensation-based training, which is we're moving from a model that really is amplifying a finite structure, right? There's known rules and outcomes, and there's an end date, and there's a winner, and that describes most sports. Like the rules are arbitrary, but you abide by them, and they mostly have to do with like, honestly, finishing the game. Like I want the game to be over so that I can be declared the winner, and I can like move on either to the next game or the next iteration. Now, if this is what we're trying to do, it is almost an equal opposite intention as an infinite game, which is I'm not trying to finish. In fact, if the game ends, I'm dead. I'm trying to keep this game going. So like you're figuring out how to stay in play as opposed to end it. And these like opposite intentions are based on the very probably basic concept of goal oriented. Like people are imagining fitness as this arrival where once I have a six pack, once I win a high rocks, once I can run my PR 5K, or I get like a double body weight deadlift, or whatever the measurement or the goal is, once I can achieve that, I'll be good. Happiness is on the other side of this arbitrary goal, and it's finite. And what you realize along the way is this is it's like, I talk about it like cultivating fitness is like understanding hunger or love or something. It's like a quality that you're trying to always maintain, and therefore you have to pay attention to it and foster it in with the right environments and the right people that are involved into it.
Yeah, I think I saw something the other day which like it resonated quite well with like people seeing fitness as a thing they can acquire rather than fitness being a set of practices you do. Fitness is a behavior that if you stop doing that behavior, you don't have fitness anymore. You have to do those things to have it.
Yeah,
but you can't acquire it. It's not something you like, I have fitness now. It's no, the behaviors you do is fitness, which I really liked. It's like, no, you need to do these things on repeat and tweak them and find what's right. That was like, I think actually my first article on Substack was titled, Are You Really an Athlete?
Yeah, right.
And it was on that exact, like the mindset difference between like, you can do athletic things, you can train like an athlete, and you can do competitive competitions, but it's the mindset at which you approach your training which makes the difference. Like, is your whole training and all you do dedicated towards improving the outcome in that specific task? If that's what you're training for and that is the goal, then you're an athlete. I'm training is to improve my outcome in this task. If it's to improve the quality of your life as a whole, then you're not an athlete, but you can still do athletic things and take part in athletic activities. But the way you view, this is what I'm trying to communicate to so many of our clients, the ones who sign up for High Rocks is the prime example, because they're doing this training, which is really helping them to feel good, reduce the risk of injuries, give them good energy. And then they sign up for our High Rocks and they go, okay, now I need to be this type of fit on this date. And they change what they're doing. And then they're beaten up, they're sore, they're tired. They finished that race and they go, now I don't know what to do with myself. And it's like, well, was that a net positive on your life? Did it help you in any way? Or would it actually detract from what you're trying to do? Because you don't have to do these things. You can just not do a High Rock. Right?
They are voluntary.
Yeah. But it seems to be like that whole, I need something in my calendar or I won't work hard towards them, which I think for someone who's been doing fitness for so long, that's quite an alien concept to me, because it's actually like one of the key moments for me of a realization of like, there's more to it than physical outcomes, was the training group that I trained with at the gym. They predominantly just do bodybuilding training. And we train together as a group of guys, like proper bro sessions, like chest, arms, kind of the classic. And one of them raised the question, like, if you were to never get a physical adaptation or any more improvement, would you still do this every day? And we all went, yeah, I would. And I think a lot of them meant it from like the enjoyment of the training session, like getting a punk with your bros and having fun. Then afterwards, I thought about it and I was like, even if I was doing this by myself, I would still do it every day. But if I'm not getting anything physiologically from it, then why would I do this every day? Like, what is the real reason for that? And that's when the kind of the real click of, okay, I think it's the behaviors that I developed from it. And that like facing some discomfort and some adversity and voluntarily choosing to confront them. But there was a real moment of like, yeah, I would do this every single day still if I never got any more physical adaptations from this.
I think that's that's autotelia, right? Like that is for the sake of it. And there's something in the recognition or the meditation of going through a practice, even without a net gain, there's still something to be gained. And that's hard for most people to understand because we are transactional by nature. You know, I pay this, I get this in return. I give this effort, it might pay off like this. Well, when you look at all of the transactions that don't work, you start to understand that like, we have bad models for that we try to like generalize, and fitness is probably one of them. It's very hard to talk somebody into spending an hour a day in a room working very hard with no positive outcome out of that, or at least like, you know, that wasn't recognizable in how people treated them. But there is a positive outcome, and that is the weird part. Is like the behaviors and the sensations are so strange. And I would argue the interesting part is like, I think we're both moving towards the same direction, which is I'm getting away from the logical part of my mind that is saying, if I do this, then I get this. And I'm moving into the place which most athletes develop kind of on accident, which is I have to override my logical brain's ability to convince me to do or not do something. Now, most people, when they're, you know, motivation is high and they can think about doing something, they will then feel good about their effort and then they'll give the effort. What you realize in developing kind of like a competitive mindset is like, I have to override that part because I just have to start doing it, and then I will feel a certain way and then I will think differently about it. And that's the model that we kind of like first described, was like, I see each training session as movement first, then decide based off of how I feel, and then that will dictate how I think about it. And how I think about it is the feedback loop for the behavior. So you mentioned some complex behaviors, like, you know, addressing fear and addressing, you know, resilience or discomfort or something like this. And what I've noticed from the sensations, you know, I break it down by energy system because I think that's the easiest way. Like, as the fueling substrates change in the body, and the range of motion and the ballistic nature of the, you know, dynamics change, you change really the sensations that are coming from it. And that in turn will start to change the architecture of how you think about things. So, you know, it became probably most obvious through aerobic capacity work when I was like, when I just saw it so instantaneously. It was kind of like a light went off, and then I was like, cool, and I ran with it, and it really worked. And I was at the time I was writing the manual. Did you read Capacity? Okay. Yeah. A little bit is threaded in that, but when I was writing aerobic capacity, when I was writing it, I was like, you know, dude, what a weird subject to write about. First of all, like this is like an amorphous, ambiguous thing that we describe. It has to do with like field sports and CrossFit and this, but not endurance, although it's related to endurance. So I was really having a hard time funneling or even starting it. And what I noticed is like in the morning, I'd come in and train. And at the time, I wasn't competitive at the time, but I was going to do this kind of a shooting fitness competition here. And it was on the horizon. So it was like a lot of work capacity stuff. So it's just like, I just need to pick up something heavy and move it around and breathe a little bit. So I started doing these like 45 to an hour and a half long slogs that were just like farmer's carries, lots of work capacity, but not hard. Like, I was sweating buckets, but I was not like breathing out my lungs. And I noticed that, you know, doing these sessions, especially if it's under an hour and it has the right tempo or, you know, perceived exertion, I would then immediately go right into my office and I would start typing, and I would have like, you know, in a couple hours, 5,000 words or something like that. And I'd be like, oh, that's wild. You know, I'm really coming up with some good ideas. And then one day I didn't do that. And I think I had a strength session or something like that. And then I came to the office and I was like, nothing. I have nothing. I can't think. I can't even look straight. And I'm like, maybe I'm just tired, whatever. Well, I came back the next day after doing like one of these grinders, and then boom, it came on. And I was like, oh, weird. I think this has like, I think how I'm moving is really influencing how my brain is working. And it's highly creative. Now, that idea, I would love to say like, man, I ran with it. I was like, I didn't actually, like, I recognized it, but I made of no importance until I had 75,000 words for this entire kind of like manual. And I needed, it's like too much. There's like, sorry, there's too much creativity here. I need to like edit this thing down. And I would come in from one of those sessions because I really liked how it felt and it gave me good energy for like writing. And I would go to edit a paragraph and I would delete a sentence and I would write like 6 more. And I was like, fuck, this is not editing. And then it dawned on me like, well, if how I'm training out there is influencing how I'm writing, I wonder if I changed it.
Yeah. So strength training for editing days.
So here's what's weird. I went to another form of capacity. I went to hard intervals, right? So the intensity went up and the focus went up and the neurochemistry changed. So I started doing like 7x3 minute expo, which is not cool. You can't keep that up. So I knew this is only possible every once in a while, but I think my first session was 7x3. And then the next session I was doing an IWT, which is like some weightlifting in a 2-minute interval with 6 intervals altogether. And I would come in and I would chop that thing in half. And it was like, oh shit, it works. And then I, finished it, did whatever. And I kind of was like, oh, that's like a very novel thing that was happening. Creativity and basically high amounts of focus. And I was relating it to like an ability to persist, right? Like this ability to come in and out of adding things and taking them away is really the creation process. And I was like, okay, that's cool. It's novel. And it wasn't really until I was rewriting the strength manual that I understood almost immediately that strength is misidentified by people and that the energy that it fosters is much different than we think. It really does have to, this comes back to like, you explaining the Indonesian or Chinese weightlifters being internally sensitive. Well, it dawned on me in the weirdest way possible. I get a lot of broken power lifters, like a lot of them, these big guys, 300 pounds, 350 pounds that, they're deadlifting in the, 700, 800 pound area. And then they break themselves on the sport because again, amateur sports is usually jump to the peak expression. They don't do a correct build. They don't correctly, facilitate their capacities or ramp up their tissue. So they have like a 5 to 6 year run, and then boom, everything comes apart, which makes sense when you really look at it. But to them, it's very, very frustrating. What I noticed is that, this is weird, but they were all overly emotional, right? Like they would start crying sometimes. And how I'd fix a powerlifter is like, you're not touching a barbell for years, dude. You're like done. You know, we're going to do some bodybuilding. We're going to do some endurance work and some aerobic work and mobility. And we're going to get you like moving, and then eventually rebuild the system. And what I watched people go from being like hyper emotional to kind of like a neutral and normal expression. So this was like, at first I was like, you know, Erin's a FDN, so she's constantly looking at what chemicals are going through people's bodies and explaining basically like when a man has too much estrogen or they have too much dopamine or not enough serotonin. We can see all of that, but we were dealing with something that was so weird. I was kind of like, it doesn't seem like biochemical necessarily to me. It's like a weird expression of emotionality. And as soon as we got their confidence back and they felt physical again, the sensitivity would drop. And I was like, that's really interesting, until I recognized on like an accidental post that I was writing about, you know, we strengthen, just to like jump to it, we strengthen based off of like the joint and the tissue specifically. So instead of trying to like improve a lift, which is kind of an expression of strength, a combination of strength, I tried to get the specific joint to exhibit strength-like behaviors in ranges of motions that make sense to what I want it to be. And in doing that, I was really like paying attention to a shoulder in flexion, and I was really evaluating, and really what it came down to is like, I can't feel it. I can't feel my flexion. Therefore, I can't express it. And I was like, okay, if I can't feel it, I can't control it. And therefore I need to like increase sensitivity. And I was like, oh, fuck, strength is sensitivity. Like it's a degree of sensitivity. And immediately I understood that when you unbalance the system and become hypersensitive to the internal mechanism in order to guard your spine against 1,000 pounds or something like that, when that system breaks, the emotional system is right behind it. Because again, when we move, we feel and we think. And therefore, how people were moving was priming their emotional wavelengths and had their thought process behind everything. When the movement collapses, so does the emotionality and the thought process. And I was like, okay, everything, this is kind of when it unfolds, like everything is probably related to that. Like, and this is the really weird part. So I started looking at how we fixed them. And I started looking at other powerlifters and how they had come back, and man, everybody comes back to bodybuilding, right? What I would describe as strength endurance or hypertrophy training. And I was like, go back to Arnold. Think about Arnold, right? Like he's the OG, and he's not the original, but he is the fucking GOAT. When you think about Arnold, all you can think about is confidence and charisma, right? He is I don't know, the biggest character that you could ever get out of bodybuilding. And that's what sold it. He was a great spokesperson for the sport. But realistically, I started thinking about like what people see the person on stage posing, they see the muscularity, and they go, oh yeah, that guy's probably really confident based off of what he looks like, right? And you're like, what if it's an inverse? What if how he moved developed the confidence? And realistically, when you define confidence, it really is a predictive quality of your brain to know the outcome of something, right? My confidence in a situation. And when you look at bodybuilding, the slow and controlled time under tension, the slow increases of weights and tensions and angles allows obviously the building of the tissue, but realistically it's building a map internally for the brain to know that if I move in this manner, in this kind of control, not only will I survive it, but I'll get growth out of this. And therefore I start to build a map. If I do X, Y, and Z, I get X, Y, and Z.
Like a predictable outcome.
This is confidence. And then when we see somebody on stage, we're literally just looking at the biomechanical chemical brew that leads to what we see as confidence. And when people, where this gets cut short, is like people can go, oh, that person's muscular, I'm insecure. Maybe they won't even identify that. In fact, most places people can't identify that they're insecure, but they see somebody who is secure potentially, and they go, I want that. So they start copying what they're doing, but maybe they take the shortcut. Maybe they're like, oh, you know, add a little of this agent in, or maybe I get some anabolic steroids or TRT or, you know, peptides or any of these things. And maybe they grow, but it's in an unequal proportion to how the muscle naturally develops a knowing. So did you see that I want to call it he's an Australian bodybuilder that looked almost just like Arnold, Cal Munger or something.
Callum von Moger, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Great physique, you know. Did you watch that show?
Yeah, so actually it's quite, he is now, so kind of what you're discussing there is making me smile, making me laugh, because I like one of the gyms I'm around quite frequently. We share space with them. My gym, they're a one-to-one personal training gym, and a lot of bodybuilders, and there's a lot of them who are dabbling in the dark arts, shall we say. And it's very interesting to see how, like, there's a real fine line between developing your physique, building confidence, and it building narcissism, and like a really fragile confidence.
Yeah.
Right. And it's really a very fine line. And the fine line seems to be tipped over significantly more when someone does that and goes on anabolic steroids. And I said about Callum von Moger because he's now working at a gym which is owned by one of my ex-colleagues from that gym. So I was like, oh, yeah. And I know exactly what you mean. And that kind of real, like, someone you look at and you're like, you should be an incredibly confident human being, but it's not real confidence. It's not true confidence.
Yeah. So you nailed it, which is like in my model, you know, like the oversensitization when strength breaks a person comes out. When you build a model or a body or a physique on the tenets of confidence, but you skip the parts that make you actually confident, I do think you end up at a form of narcissism, which is an overly concerned self-interest or something like that. Not like classical psychological narcissism, but I would say like self-interest. And I bring up I don't know what von Monger is like, but watching that reality show, it was interesting to identify, like, obviously amazing physique. No one would take any of the work that he's done away, but it was obviously enhanced through substances because his development was premature, right? Like he had a physique that would take somebody 10 years to build and even with, like, I would say anabolics at the right stages, it would still be further down the road. When you start looking at how kind of golden age bodybuilders were working, because they were on anabolics too, but it was such a different process, right? It was so much later in the game, and it was so much harder to find. And it was so much like the dark arts. It was unknown, and there was only a few people that could kind of like tell you how to do it. And they wouldn't tell you unless you earned. They were gatekeepers to like, no, you got more work to do, man. Like, just keep going and keep eating and do the thing. So when you see that documentary, what you'll notice is the obvious thing. Obviously he pops a bicep, right? Well, it's obvious why, right? Now, and then he pops 2 quad tendons or something like that. And then watch the I would say the veneer of self-confidence crumble, right? But when you look at somebody like Arnold, like his physique was built on 15 years of competitive powerlifting and weightlifting, right? It was built on like just an absolute obsession with developing himself. And then maybe he layered anabolics on it, but it wasn't the predisposition. It wasn't the thing that the foundation was built off. So when we're looking at like powerlifters coming back from being able to express sensitivity, and this is where it get really weird, because sensitivity is strength to me. And this is where I diverge from most people. And I'll have this conversation with a lot of people, but I don't think we define strength correctly. I do not think that strength is a movement necessarily. It could be a deceleration, but I think of power as acceleration. So whenever you see somebody complete a back squat, yes, they have to be strong in order to lift a heavy back squat, but the act is one of power, right? Like there's movement in there. It's an expression of force. Now, why I describe it, why I think most people are confused that it's a strength exercise, is because it starts on the eccentric side of it and the isometric. And most people lose it when they overcome, right? When they're trying to overcome that isometric part, they come out of the hole in the concentric phase, and then they'll lose it because they lose the shape of the spine or something like that. And I say it might be limited off of strength, but it is an expression of power still. The reason I think that's important is because power is really this like behavior of agency, right? It's this expression of aggression and predetermination and will. It's probably the peak expression of free will, if I really had to describe it. And this is why I see, there's nothing more impressive, and I think you probably would say the same thing, as the real deal athlete that can jump in the air and it almost looks like they pause in time, right? They're so explosive. And that power expression is realistically what we're witnessing is like an ability for someone to almost break the laws of physics. They can't, but it appears that way. And that's what we say is like, this comes back around to like how, we encapsulate a lot of philosophy into what we're talking about, which is like watching somebody exert their force on something is really the age-old question, right? This is like, do I have a controller in me, or all of this is predestination? And development of physical attributes is really what first determines, am I a victim of my circumstance or am I a victor? Like, and this explains almost all of competition. Can I overcome the resistance or the forces of the world and determine my will? And so when I look at that, you look at all these attributes, and when you jumble them together and you're balanced correctly, you're basically a human who has agency and can determine their future.
That's a really nice way of looking at it, of using your physical training to prove to yourself that you can control your own future and you can change what you want to change. Yeah. That's a really, like, I think for me, like, I'm much earlier down the journey of the exploration of this than you are. Like, you've spent a lot more time and been a lot more aware of these things for longer and having these thoughts for a lot longer. And I kind of want to get an idea for you of how do you find having or helping other people explore these? Because that's something that I struggle with, of like, I want people to understand the value of fitness and training, and outside of just needing a adaptation and an instant, like, this is what I get in return straight away. Do you find you have to almost like wait for people to come to you on it, or how do you start those?
Yes and no. I think I'm very on the nose with it. Imagine it like you can make anybody aware of what you're aware of. And then it's just really thinking about a strategy to thread the arc, right? So like all of the things that we've talked about are threaded into kind of how getting another person to understand it through story, through narrative, through through teaching them different concepts that are either physiological or psychological or emotional. And a lot of times I'll do it right from the get-go. If somebody comes to me and they say like, let's take the transformation, because I think that's the most disgusting thing to a personal trainer is like this, like, hey, listen, I've been a shithead for 40 years of my life, but now I would really like the image of somebody who looks like they take care of themselves. And it's generally on the precipice of an event like a divorce, a health scare. There's always some kind of, there's a call to adventure, you could say, which is like he or she needs to enter into a extraordinary world in order to transform themselves. Now, I use the hero's journey as framework pretty much to a T, right? I'm a mentor, right? I'm here to only point out the pitfalls, but somebody has to accept the invitation, and there's a threshold for that. For me, that's testing their mettle on how open they are about their own situation. Can they see themselves accurately? So before I allow somebody to be in this process, I really test that with kind of insane questions. And if you saw my intake form for like people that I coach virtually, or even people that come in the conversations that we had, you're like, what the fuck is happening here? Because it's not necessarily like, where's your injuries? How's your shoulder feel? It's really like, point to me the part that hurts, and I'm not talking physically. You know, like what is the what is the biggest insecurity? So when a lot of people like, oh man, I'd really like to, they'll be gentle with it, because nobody wants to sound like a narcissist. So they're like, I'd really like to improve my health. I'm like, just tell me that you want to be jacked and you're willing to do whatever it is because you have a sense of smallness in the world and you want to be taken seriously. So I usually cut through that straight away, and I just go, just tell me. And if you can't be honest about it, we can't have a conversation here. So once we can discover what the real limitation is, I relate it then to probably, I use some framework, but I look at these socio-psychological necessities that are not talked about a lot. We have a real desire in our life to be accepted by society, but most certainly we need some needs facilitated. I need to feel significant. I need to feel like I have power or agency. And this relates down to like 6 main concepts, but a lot of them have to do with like connecting with other people, feeling like I'm advancing or growing, some kind of certainty, some kind of variety, some kind of significance. And in discovering those and asking like, what do you think the most important are? People will generally subconsciously identify what they're not getting in their life by listing what's most important to them. Because much like, if I caught you on the right day, if we use Maslow's hierarchy or Maslow's order of hierarchy, we would go like, hey, Stu, how you feel today? And if you hadn't had a drink of water in 2 days, you'd be like, thirst. Even if you didn't know what to call that. Now, imagine that most people, because we've been trained to think about things, not feel them, they're unaware of their necessity. So somebody who's missing, like, say, communal connection, or they're missing appreciation for themselves or something like that, somebody who's missing that quality, they will most often try to supplement it with something else, which is like eating to cover thirst. Which means unless I'm eating lettuce or cucumber, it's not really going to help. And it's the wrong action. So we first try to discover that. And once I can pinpoint what somebody's kind of necessities are, I can then develop a psychological map for what they need. And this sounds really like kind of woo-woo, and to some degree it probably is. But the model really cuts to the heart of the bigger picture for people, which is you are using fitness as a temporary fix, and that's why it doesn't work. And so once I can like kind of like point them to the direction of the thing that they're trying to do, I can facilitate the action that helps them receive that necessity. And it really falls in line. So when I map my behaviors and traits for, certain systems, when somebody comes in and they need to lose weight, we can do that a bunch of different ways, right? I don't even need to like exercise to do that. I can shape the person's diet and nutrition, and we can probably lose weight, aside from, dosing somebody on GLP-1s or something like that. Let's just say that there's a lot of like mechanisms that we can use. And if somebody comes in and they need muscle mass, well, there's only a few ways we can do that. So they need to relate to the behavior trait, right? If they have massive amount of confidence, they're not going to really develop or see the utility in developing themselves through bodybuilding. Now, they might still do the action, they just won't need the output of developing muscle tissue. They'll still go through strength endurance, and that's where we gear it more towards like a workhorse kind of feel, like more like what I would call like farm strength, which has nothing to do with putting on size, but it has to do with work capacity. And then if somebody is, cynical, we see this all the time, like, a lot of endurance athletes are very untrustworthy, but a lot of people don't have trust in themselves, and it's because they've eroded it by abusing themselves with exercise. And so this is a really interesting thing where like somebody might be able to go really far, but that's because they're overriding all of the signals to self-care.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So it's usually each one of these spheres, what do we call these like bubbles, what I classify as like aerobic capacity, strength and power, in strength endurance is kind of in between there, and endurance, a lot of these have kind of like a dichotomy to them, where like, yes, you have to be able to like push past into discomfort, which is where I would agree with like how you wrote about endurance. So you're recognizing these first behavior traits that come up, which is like, oh, this has a lot to do with the conversation in my head and how I have perspective on my effort. You know, what we like to say is like, if you finished 100-mile race, bike, run, doesn't really matter. You probably could. We'd be like, hey, Stu, could you run 100 miles? And right now you'd be like, fuck me, I'd walk it, but I would get through it, right? I would find a way. Now, if I said, you know, at the end of that 100 miles, could you do another 100? The answer would probably be no. But if I asked you if you could get 200 miles, you would make it happen. So really, a lot of our endurance just has to be on our expectations about how to build a proper effort map, because they're, and logically, I would say you can't, because you haven't ranked the effort correctly, the perception correctly. In that effort of articulating the time domain required to expend energy, you have to, why we described as endurance is because there's going to be a point where your internal resources are too few. And therefore, endurance becomes about how I facilitate resources to myself, also known as self-care, right? So food, hydration is mostly what people think about, but the real mechanism here is like the wear and tear. Am I taking care of my tissues and the hot spots on my feet and the chafing in my armpits and in my legs? If you don't address the blisters on your feet, you'll never, like, I don't care how hydrated you are. So realistically, self-care is about this conversation, which is how far can I go? And the other conversation that should be combating it, which is what do I need to get there? Like what kind of resources do I need? And this is
that balance again.
Yeah, it's a more gentle conversation. If you'll notice, like, I don't know how popular it is over there, but David Goggins is like a hero over here, right?
Yeah, there was a very good, you know who Ross Edgley is?
No. I've heard of him.
So Ross Edgley is the British guy who swam around Great Britain.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. And he talks about this a lot, about how his interaction with different endurance athletes and what strategy they use to get through endurance. And one of the examples he uses, Dave Goggins, which is just like basically negative talk, like self-hatred, like just hating yourself into doing it. Whereas he goes for gratitude and like eudaimonia, basically, of just like, I'm so lucky to be here. I'm so lucky to have these people supporting me to do this. Because he was like, I can self-hatred my way through, I don't know, 50K swim. But like, after, like, when you're on your 20th day, it's just so much more fatiguing to do it through negative and self-hatred. Whereas you got to find a way that you as an individual can keep positive if you're looking for a real endurance, which was quite interesting.
Precisely. Yeah. I would 100% agree with that notion. And I also say, like, the problem is like our behavior, if you study this, essentially, we'll get into some pop psychology a little bit, but essentially our behavior is the accumulation of our justification of events that have happened to us. And how we interpret something is totally up to priming, like how we felt on the day, what happened to us before that. So our identity, if you break this down into like a fucking crazy degree, essentially, I have this like identity. I'm this way. I think I'm like this because this happened to me. But realistically, it's just about the story I told me about the things that happened to me. And to be honest, 90% of those are fabricated. Most of my memories are fabricated justifications to things that I put into context that I thought was helpful for me at the time. Now, that's every event. That's who I interact with at work. My traumas, my car accident, all of these things start to accumulate. And we just think that the way we act is based off of an accurate perception of those events. But realistically, those events are based off of like subconscious things, right? Like, and this is why the top-down model doesn't work, because let's say you go into work and somebody says like, hey, Stu, nice shirt. And you're like, what the fuck? Like, that was a pass. Like your internal judgment and mechanism about trying to decide, was he trying to say this, or was he being a dick, or like, is he making a funny thing? it will be based off of how you feel on that day. And if you just got cut off in traffic and somebody messed up your coffee order and you didn't have a good night's sleep, that person's now your enemy. And now you've built a whole narrative that down the road, you will have to keep that narrative and that, you know, you're a dick to that person from now on. Yeah, assume like that's what most subconscious people are like. Oh, like that guy was rude to me, so I'm rude back. Well, build out that everywhere. And then we start looking at the identity and we go, this is a construct that I was not in control of, admittedly. From the time I was basically 7 to, you know, the time that I was around 30 and I started to become vastly aware of my deficiencies. And after my prefrontal cortex is kicked in and all of the other stuff comes out, I start going like, why am I like this? Like I'm thinking about the world in this really weird way, but I don't feel like that is me. I just feel like that's something that I've adopted from something else. So when we look at that architecture, we really look at like, you know, changing something physically or through physiology or through sport or through fitness. We're really looking at that model of like, are we going to deconstruct this person? That is a nightmare, but it's also probably required for most people to fundamentally change their perception of fitness. And that's why some people just need a pre-framing. And that I'll give the like difference is like, you know, somebody wants to do the thing, they have the time, the resources to do it, they're just not motivated. Well, they just need to understand the leverage points better, right? They just need to put it in perspective so they can make these things happen. Now, most people use pre-framing as a sergeant, right? They use motivation. We're taught to we're taught to move through punishment or discipline. What we call discipline, we put on ourselves. So now we can relate this back to endurance and the behavior trait. Why does every military faction in the world use running as their modality, right? Constant daily running is generally the prescription. And that's because the behavior trait is discipline. Now, David Goggins, coming from like a militaristic background, saw that that was really useful to get him to do things that he couldn't do before he joined the military. Remember, he was like a fat, out of shape, kind of like complacent person. And then he found a model that was made to shape somebody a very specific way, to not ask questions, to just do what they're told. And he ran with that and amplified it. And that is what kind of like made him him. Now, that I think it's like, it's totally fine how people figure out how to do things. I just look at, you know, are there better ways? And like this Ross guy that you're talking about has discovered, there's a cost to doing it just one way. And what I find is like in fitness and in endurance, there's like, especially endurance, I should say, but in all the attributes, there's this feedback loop of balancing out the system. And this is what led me to kind of detract or like pull away from sport expression, because it's an unbalanced expression. It has a finite timeline for kind of what we're talking about. So now I wager most people of like, you know, would you rather have a 600-pound deadlift right now, or would you rather be able to deadlift 300 pounds when you're 70? But the answer is obvious, I think, to most people, because we're looking at the arc. Now, most people
other than real
20,
Olympic, other than really competitive, fully successful athletes, because that's actually really, there was a piece of research done on Olympic athletes where it was, would you take 10 years off your life to win a gold medal? And like all of them said yes.
Yeah, exactly right. That's precisely right. And I think the asterisk on that comment is like, most of those people are under 30, probably between 20 and 25, have not developed a prefrontal cortex.
If you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, like when you met me, I probably would have said a 600-pound deadlift. Like honestly.
Exactly. Yeah. And that is I think that is like, that is the human experience. Oh, you know, when we're 20, what are we grasping at though? You know, like the things that we're looking for 20 is to, and this will explain a lot of why people are driven to sport. We don't really have a coming of age. We don't have a rite of passage that says, hey, Stu, you're now a man and you're a productive member of society. Western culture doesn't really have that. So we look towards sport, military, financial success, family success, something to just prove that our existence is, not futile. And I think a lot of the times when that stuff gets impressed on us, the whole story isn't really revealed to us. And then we are pretty much convinced that this is I would give up 10 years of my life, because do you know what I'm feeling that I haven't addressed yet is that I don't feel significant in my existence. And therefore, I won't be existing for very long. If you know anybody that is battling like an insignificant feeling and a disconnection from society, we're talking about somebody who's probably facing anxiety and depressive symptoms, and that person will self-annihilate, funny enough. And so, not necessarily funny enough, but that's like, not that it's a humorous subject, but it really does show that in our 20s, we're trying to establish all of these things that almost nobody understands. And we're using these mechanisms that really facilitate at least some kind of helpful bridge into our personality and our identity. And therefore we attach deeply to them. But when those structures start to fail us, because again, all models are wrong, some are useful, it's really hard to rewrite this script. So you're interesting, like your path with athletics is like, man, I don't know what it's like to be good at something, but watching you for the first time, and you were, I imagine, a couple years into weightlifting when I first met you, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
watching your expression and okay, so seeing the potential, I gotta admit, was like, there was a lot of sadness there for myself, appreciation for you, but there was a lot of sadness in there because I recognized that your potential is so much higher than mine. And I had not yet discovered that the answer to my potential was not weightlifting. Yeah. That was such a disappointing feeling. Although it was obvious, I was like in my 30s when I met you, and there's nothing, I didn't start till I was like, 27 or something like that. But you could quite literally see the expression in your physicality was much different than mine. Now, I've obviously, that caused a lot of identity issues, because it was like, well, if I'm not good at something, how am I going to be significant? And that this question comes up kind of all the time. How am I going to facilitate my necessities that give me what my identity is presupposed off of?
I often think, like, again, I moved over to a side of the world where religion is still much more prominent and much stronger, especially from the UK. It's kind of very much fell out of, not popularity, but like
fashion. Yeah.
It's not practiced anywhere near as much. And all of these things, like you say, like all models are wrong, some are useful. And it's like that, like religions are a model of providing that, right? And when they're not being utilized and being like as popular, people are looking for another way of finding that worth. And it's almost like sport is trying to fill that, but cannot fill that.
I would 100% agree. And this is, I mean, not to like, I look at the religious model as something that's very useful for society. And when I look at what it's doing, what are they doing? They're essentially assigning kind of like moral action and a framework to make better decisions so that you have, I would say, better outcomes in your life. Let's say that's the baseline for most religions, whether it's Buddhism, Islam, or it's Christianity or something like that. It really is trying to give you a map that makes your outcome better. And that would have like family values and all of these, let's just say, secular
intrinsic value and like intrinsic value, and that you almost don't need to prove yourself as such, which is an interesting one, because that's kind of what I got from like that if you follow a certain religion, you are valued by that religion and that God, regardless of what you do. So it provides that value, and then you don't need to almost like prove that value as much.
I think that's I think sport is a kind of a sport, or the expression, or how to frame this, but let's talk about it like as it's a concept that's bigger than yourself. Right. And you're basically in service for the expression of this event, and it is a tradition. Like when we look at the Olympics, like I can't imagine how much like honor there is to be called by your country to be one of the best athletes in the world and represent on the big stage. That has more to do than like, how fast your 100-meter is. It really has to do like the concept of your nation. And that's really why I think they were able to drill this into the original Soviet model, is because think about how, they didn't have a god, right? Like there was communism was the god. The architecture for the government was the thing. And so when we look at all these models, I think government is the same. Like when we look at socio-political models like communism or capitalism or socialism, a lot of these models are just absolutely wrong, but they're good engineering for the people that don't want to think about it or can't think about it. And I think about sport as kind of the same. Realistically, when I look at each model, instead of saying that it's wrong, I like to say like, well, what did they get right? What are the methodologies that are really helpful? And if we go through and I go like, I'm not a religious person. I don't ascribe to any one true religion, but I see immense value in structure and how they relate to communities, and a lot of the bad stuff comes with it as well. Just like, I think sport's great, but also look at the negative side. What I'm trying to get to, at least in my own practice, and maybe this sounds like maybe aggressively hopeful, is I think there's a model here that is secular and more accurate for the individual that doesn't have one of these things. And I think trying to understand how our own behavior unfolds without being told that we're like have a disease or something. You know what I mean? Like the DSM is probably one of the most harmful books that's ever been written, which is just describing everything in the brain as a disorder that isn't regulatory towards a very narrow expression of how the brain works. But that's like looking at, if you're in school, I wasn't a good student necessarily, and I was thought of as being dyslexic. And you're like, what that means is like, I wasn't able to coordinate words correctly yet in the right order. And that took it took me longer to like understand something. Now, what's interesting is like, there's 72 different lexias, right? There's 72 different ways of taking in information. And because I didn't do the one that they were talking about, I have a disorder.
You're wrong.
Yeah, you're like, okay, so there's like a better model. And I think the better model is what I'm working on is kind of like this exact subject. How can moving our physicality influence how we feel and influence our thoughts? And how can that be directed towards living in a way that is, I would say conscious? How can we develop better relationships? How can we have better life experiences? Which is quite literally has me redefining fitness. So, and redefine, I mean, by going back to the old definition of it, which is like the traits and behaviors for survivability, which tells us originally. Now it's like, none of this is new, but when we're looking at it, we're very few people in the world talking about how behaviors and traits are related to physical expression. However, that was quite literally the original definition.
Yeah, and why people did it originally and what it was originally designed for.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, in the case of natural selection, so the 1700s, they were like, "Hey, how does that animal survive?" We're like, "Well, here's the behaviors and the traits, and that's defined as its fitness." And you go, "Oh, crazy!" And then fast forward into who knows what happened, and we look at fitness like, "Well, does he have a six pack?" And you're like, "What the fuck?
What's his VO2 max?" Okay.
Exactly, and you're like. When we look at it that way, when I look at like survivability in the modern world, we're not talking about fighting, saber-toothed tigers or something like that. And that's how most people relate, the physical attributes or whatever. But we are specifically really trying to define what I need to move forward and live a better life. And so I really do think that like understanding endurance, how to take care of yourself, how to build trust within yourself and discipline. And, how to develop a level of sensitivity to structure yourself against, forces of the world and then produce power against them. How to ensure that you can be creative, but also focused. I think like just taking these, 6 major aspects and applying them, I think can get you much better results in life because you won't flounder so much and you can root yourself to a consistent practice. And then when you start looking at it, you go, oh, that's what the Greeks did actually. When you start looking at gymnasia was a school for the elite to learn how to argue, how to debate, rhetoric, and wrestling, and javelin throwing. It's essentially like they built their entire curriculum on moving first. So you would go to the Center for Naked Exercise, and you would, develop yourself, and then you would sit in what the Brazilians describe today in Portuguese as hensa, which is the conversation that's elicited after combat. And when you look at these like traditions, you're like, man, we have known for a really long time. If you look at anything that Socrates said or Plato said, they've known for a really long time that there's a very close distinction or connection between how we move, our physicality, and our philosophy, or how we view the world. And I think all I want to do is like bring that back.
Yeah.
I want that to be the core.
Those two spheres have just separated, right? You have your philosophical thought leaders over here, you have your physicality and your athletes over here, and they've just diverged rather than where they're meant to be, where they originated together.
Yeah, and I think bringing that back, that's a unification process. That's like, I think I see it obviously in how I write, and that's why I really respect people like yourself that like go back to being like, no, I got it. Like there's stuff to figure out here, and it's a business. I get it. Like you got to put out information that appeals to the culture and drives attention to the better ideas. And sometimes that's like cringeworthy, but I don't hold it against anybody. What I do want to find is that people are diving deep into the real subjects. And that's why as soon as you started writing long form, I started really paying attention. You know what I mean? Like it was like, something's going to happen here. And sure enough, it was like within a couple of articles, and I read them all, it was like, okay, sciencey, like, okay, coming up with like how you are modeling the world, and eventually, boom, now you're seeing.
I'm trying to like alternate, just because like for me, I think if I focus too much on the philosophical side, I'll lose a decent amount of people who are there just to learn some more niche topics on the more sciencey side. And kind of for me in my community, that's kind of more what I'm known for. Because of my education background, and I me, and I think you are still as well, still fascinated by that whole area. You love going into the weeds, but for me, it has to balance with the philosophical side of it. Otherwise, it's like it's all this science for no real reason, no real substance.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Like I like the balance. I love the ins and outs, because as soon as it starts to thread, I think it is one subject, but for people to understand it, you really do have to build it out quite a bit. And I think I love going back and forth, because the physiology is still fascinating to me. You're like, the little details that we know now are like incredible. And we didn't have a lot of this information before. And now how we're connecting to kind of like, even the mechanics of breathing, and all of this stuff is coming out as like, absolutely insane for how it regulates the brain and the mood, and all of it is going to come into this one picture. I think what I find fascinating is like, and also, I would say makes me feel a little bit helpless, is like looking at the 20-something-year-olds that are, jacked, and restating or being responsible for the major themes that are getting discussed when they don't really understand like the bigger picture. So that, they're assigning truths to things that don't really exist. That's kind of what I would like to see kind of more balanced out, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. I mean, the TikTok bros talking about mechanical tension being everything for life. Yeah.
For sure.
I think that's the problem, is it takes time in the industry and experience in it. And as we said at the start, almost going too far down one route to almost end up full circle to actually think about these things. You can't, like, I wouldn't have, if we had been having this conversation 10 years ago when we first met, I would have been like, damn, Michael's a weird dude. Probably wouldn't have probably wouldn't have ended up having this conversation, and like it would have probably derailed my journey on this. It's like people need to almost be in the right place to and experience it. It comes from the experience.
Yeah. To be fair, like your question on how to like incorporate this, you really do have to know when you're going to like burn somebody with too much idea. right? And so when a client comes in, I do think I do think that physiology or the development of your physical body is philosophy in action, right? Like I really do think it's a methodology, especially when it's rooted on the concept of like bringing more awareness. Now, most traditions, Eastern especially, are about improving consciousness. Like, how can we get more conscious? How can we become more aware? And a lot of that has to do with just like meditating or some form of yoga. And funny enough, like yoga, in the West today is like this bastardized practice, but originally essentially the philosophy of 8 limbs was talking about rooting philosophy in movement. That's the original idea of yoga. And what came from it is like, now we have girls in stretchy pants doing poses and stretching, but the original root of it means to yoke, to be burdened, right? To be burdened by an idea, concept, and a weight and a load and something to overcome. So I might look at yoga and be like, this is the original strength training, and people would get mad at me today because we have a different word for it. But originally that was what the term meant. How I see it now in threading this into clients is just understanding the bigger picture and trying to pinpoint where they're at on their own journey, and then entering in as the mentor where you can. And for some people, maybe that is just understanding physical exercise, right? Like, move like this. And this is what's wrong with your biomechanics. Like I talk a lot, about, expressing the difference between the range of motion that is possible and the range of motion that you have control in, right? And we talk about these concepts loosely, but realistically what we're talking about is like, this is how the mechanics of your physical body work. Here's where you're limited. Here's where you're not. Once you can identify like, oh, I can't put my arm over my head. Okay, that's all physiology, right? We're just talking about concepts to open up that joint and understanding where they might be compromised because of that joint not opening. So, person who has poor shoulder mobility, we know that it generally affects the low back, and people that have ankle issues, it's usually the hips or whatever. We still using the fundamentals of fitness and physiology and physical training to correct things, but we're also threading in the bigger picture here and there. So in how I do it are like concepts that are, when somebody's ready for it, they will appear. And this is I would say my most famous or kind of like well-known one is the quit, don't quit conversation, which we can thread through different energy systems, but my favorite is through the capacity channel, right? Like the 10-minute air bike test is hands down, I think, one of the fastest way to recognize that there's a dichotomy inside of you, and that it's not to be frustrated with. It's not something that you learn to be a drill sergeant like David Goggins. And it's not something that you ignore. It's actually something that you engage with. The more engagement you get with the dichotomy of yourself, which is the part of yourself that wanted to do it, and then the part of yourself that's rejecting the effort, the more you can start to understand the connection between those two, the better your performance gets. So in general, I usually, I have some tests that people don't really know that are tests that I know give rise to an internal dialogue that most people become very aware of. And as soon as you point it out, they go, oh, they can't ignore it anymore. And this is one of those tricks where you're like, man, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I use like death by burpee a lot. That's like one of my favorite constructs, right? An accumulation leads to a very specific point. Now, you're probably, in your heyday for CrossFit, you're probably, super fit, close to the ground, you can get high on the rep scheme. Doesn't matter. The conversation is always the same, which is, if I work really hard this minute, I buy myself more pain.
I get to do another one.
Essentially what I want to get to the point, I'll describe this to people after, is like, there's a moment where you decide, I don't want anymore, and you quit, but you don't want the perception of quitting. So you kind of lower your pace and then you call it failure.
I didn't make it.
Yeah.
And
Damn.
You can see it. You can see it when you run those death bys in classes and in sessions. You can see that moment in people. And it's funny because I've definitely done that many a time myself, right? And you're fully convinced that no one else can see it. But when you're on the other side of it, you're like, yeah, there it is.
Yeah, bingo. I use constructs like that to bridge the gap between kind of our big thoughts on fitness and then the feeling of what these like normally abstract themes would be. And that's just how I do it. To be fair, I'm not for everybody. And so a lot of the times when I recognize that, like, I'm not going to be a good communicator for this concept or idea, I will tell somebody to go train with somebody else. You know, I think
that's actually been very important for me as well. I think with our business as well, of like, hey, like our gym's not going to be for everyone, and that's okay. I'm not trying to be for everyone. We want a select group of people who are like at the right stage of their life to start looking a little deeper and wanting to do things differently. Like usually been spinning their wheels doing something else, and they want to look a little deeper. But like for me, I've started like the way I approach it is every single one of our members gets assigned a coach who helps them on like a one-to-one coaching basis, similar to you would a personal trainer. So we do a lot of like face-to-face time, and it's like the questions asked, and that's why I try and get it out, because like on the gym floor, there's a bit of time for that, obviously, with our capacity sessions. I think Dylan, my business partner, has learned a lot of you. I put him onto your stuff not too long ago, and he really, like, he very much relates. He's very he loves his endurance, and he's like real testing himself physically, see where his mind goes. He's very into that. And he does all our capacity work for our clients, and he'll have those conversations with them in class. For me, I'm more like ask questions to my clients around why do they do certain things? Why do they train certain ways? Just try and get them to question themselves a little bit more and think a little bit deeper, because it still just amazes me how superficial fitness is, and how superficial 95% of people who are doing it, they don't take that moment to think. And when they do, it becomes so much more important to them. It becomes like, I think this was even back at Perpetua days, just before you came over. We had James Fitzgerald from OPEX come down, and we did the OPEX course. And it was even then where they went through like the priorities and aligning why you train with your priorities in life. Even that sort of thing. Still to this day, people don't do that.
Yeah.
And find that with people as well. That was a really interesting one for me. Of like, at the time, I obviously just coming from a physiology background, you're like, oh, I actually have to help people change their behavior, because athletes just do what you tell them. General population people are like, actually, like, I'm not going to do that. Can you find another way? I'm like, what? And that was a real nice one for me of like, okay, like, how can I ask them questions and get them to make their own decision about why it matters to them and what they're trying to change.
Yeah.
You're bring awareness to it.
Impact, right? Yeah. I think, and I would hate to say that there's not a way to do this. Like there's really an infinite complex kind of association with what you are to another person and how you help them. And I think discovering your talent in that is probably half the battle. You know, like, where can I show up for this person to get the biggest bang for the buck and get them to where they say they want to go? Now, in that articulation, most people come to, you know, clients are, you know, non-compliant and they don't do what you say. But realistically, I say in that case, like, yeah, everybody's going to run into that. Not every client that I had does everything that I say. I take that as a challenge to write a better narrative, right? Write a better story, keep their interest. And if I can't, I'll freely admit, like, this isn't for me, because I'm not somebody who can communicate like that. And I think you're right. I think I also predicate most of my interaction based off of questions. And I think by somebody seeing, you know, somebody who has the answers, right? Technically, like, you are the mentor, you have the answers. To watch a mentor ask more questions than say give solutions, I think people start to subconsciously recognize that is the important part of anything, is getting to what the right question is. And because if the most advanced people do this, it happened to me, like, you know, being around really great coaches over the years, I just started to notice a trend that the best coaches gave the least advice and they asked the most questions. And so I really do think, like, that tradition goes way back thousands of years into the inquiry that a lot of philosophers were doing, and they were mentors to, you know, some of the greatest people who've ever lived. Like Alexander the Great, his greatest mentor was a philosopher, Aristotle. You're like, can you imagine your teacher being Aristotle? But this was like quite literally how things have always functioned, and it was always built off of inquiry. It was always built off of like, well, what do you think that it is? Because that exploration is what I think the root of what I would say almost all motivation is just essentially like curiosity. You're like, the second you stop questioning and wondering what's possible is really where you see the coach that is just bummed and matter of fact, and he has like really no interest because he's been dejected by not only people who haven't adopted his ideas, but he's been dejected by the fact that he's not interested anymore. And therefore he's just become kind of a rote repetition of, no, you just do this. No, you just do this. And then the exploration stops and everything contracts. And so I think if nothing else, I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to discover some new things. I'm not convinced that I'm correct right yet. And I hopefully never will be, because that's the end of the process of learning. So realistically, I think my own motivation just comes from like, man, I still have questions. You know, I still want to go on that 5K run outside my house. I've run it probably 300 times, but I want to go do it again, because maybe I'll think something different, or maybe I'll play a different soundtrack, or maybe I'll run it faster. And I think if you can help just hand down that curiosity into some of your clients, I think that is the real provocation towards like, spreading good habits and good information about fitness. And once that person gets that, they will tell other people in the same way. And it becomes kind of like more of an enlightenment process.
Yeah, I agree.
That's crazy. What's next for you? What are you working on?
Next, I haven't actually got a set end topic this week.
Nice.
Work getting way ahead of me. Busy.
Okay.
But yeah, coming up to Christmas, end of year is always pretty hectic. But yeah, I tend to have like, I don't plan them very far ahead. These topics, they're like a moment where I'm usually like reading something or having a conversation with someone, and I'm like, oh yeah. And then I'm also the type of personality will then just go down a rabbit hole for the next 3 hours and get all my thoughts out of my head onto the paper, and then come back to it later and put it into something. Yeah.
We're very similar.
Congruent that other people would understand.
Nice.
Which I really like that. Like I've really enjoyed the process of that. I've never been a particularly, in the traditional sense, creative person. Like I've never been someone that interested in arts and film. And for me, I've never felt like a creative until it comes to writing and topics that I'm very interested in. And then so it's given me actually like probably my first like creative outlet, which has been
that's amazing.
Quite awesome.
Yeah, man, that's so important too. There's almost nothing, I don't know, personally more satisfying than kind of like taking an idea that feels like it comes from nowhere and feels like it's not fully formed, and then like doing the hard work of working it out and problem solving and making sure that what you're like saying is correct. And I think writing is one of the hardest creative processes. Like, you know, and I'm not a good painter, so I can't like comment on it. And I'm not, but I do, you know, videography and photography and other forms of it. And I can say like, those come naturally. Like I've never had an issue like forcing that. I just like can see it and it's done. It's almost like a split second. And even in the concept of a video and editing it, you're like, it really is just like a natural byproduct. Writing is like the antithesis of what I feel like creativity comes in a snap. It's like, oh, I have to really work at it and edit it. I do think it I would say it out loud. Like, I think it makes you a better human. Like, I think being able to do this process it'll probably influence you in ways that you don't even realize. I would challenge you that, like, you're doing long format, really start to think about long format.
Yeah, no, I have. I have. And also, like, what I like is when you think you have an idea and then you start fleshing out and you realize you don't have an idea, which is also quite that's quite actually almost as enjoyable, because you're like, you actually take the moment to really dig into it and be like, yeah, no, or you like, no, I haven't formed that fully yet. I'll leave that to the side and might come back to it later when other things add to it.
I always say on this is the exact subject. Don't ruin a tweet by trying to make it an article.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good, yeah. Just like one quick little thought, like sometimes you just start overthinking it and trying to flesh it out. And you're like, actually, no, this is just like,
this doesn't have legs. Like, this is not a big thing. This is like a quote. It's a quotable thing and it's nice. I think that's actually pretty important too. I've been rewriting the strength manual now for almost 5 years. I've rewritten it 4 times. I thought I was close to being done with it about 8 months ago, and then something popped into my head and I completely erased it and started over again. And it's like, each time I do it, it's so much better. It's so much better. And also so much more frustrating, so much more difficult. But it's that refining process that I find is threaded into our conversation and the conversations that I have with clients. I just want, I don't know when it'll be done. I kept saying that it's almost done, but now I'm stuck on it just being this working live, work.
Constant work on progress, yeah. And if it will never end up being done, but it's interesting, because I'd say from my perspective, from someone who consumes your content, like, what's stopping you just releasing it and then doing like iterations of it, updates? Like all the other scientific books I have, they have volumes, right, where they update the volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, where they put updates into it, because like, your thoughts might not be fully formed on it, but it's probably very useful and congruent for other people.
Yeah, I think so. Like, the first edition that I wrote, I'm not mad at. Like, I'm not even, it was definitely a point in time. What I love about it is that
I've got the first edition.
Yeah, it pointed to my ignorance in there, right? Like, I was like, I think I said, like, I can't quite see the model that sees the difference between, I was talking about the difference between the expression of gymnastics and the expression of like powerlifting as external and internal strength. And I can't see the model, but I know there's a difference, but they are the same attribute. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I found FRC, and they talked about the ISM, which is the internal strength model. And I was like, oh Christ, somebody already came up with it. And I studied their model. I liked a lot of their stuff. I disagree with some of it, but I was like, oh, okay, this will help influence the idea. So it's not that like it has to be dead right. It's that what I do think needs to be important is that the model is correct. And to be fair, the model keeps getting so much more complex because we're layering not just physiology, as we're trying to layer other things onto it. And I almost need like a precursor. I almost need the philosophy, and then I could have the physiology or something like that. And, the philosophy is so complex that I've been working on that for, 15 years, and I feel like I haven't even cracked anything. So it's a process. I will come out with it probably, I would say for sure next year, and hopefully in the first part of the year, because I'm working like rapidly on it. It's come, like you said, like when things drop, you just go into it. And I had about a 6-month period where I would sit to work on it, and I sit to work on it a couple times a week. Nothing would come out. And I would like, I just don't have it. And then something happened within like maybe the last month where I sat down and I finished 4 segments, and I was like, oh, this is like, okay, I was like able to bridge a gap. So I think there's something to be said about just running with it, like you're saying, like put it out, because that will tell you where to go next. And there's a part of me which goes, this has to be at least classically good, which means like even if I'm wrong, it should be useful, right?
Yeah.
So
no.
I'll wait for that. Me and Aaron haven't been to Asia yet. We're planning on going to Japan, hopefully next year.
Dude,
And
Japan's amazing.
Okay, the idea would be like to come to Singapore and maybe see you guys hang out and see.
Yeah,
that's all.
Absolutely, 100%. You are always welcome. Singapore, you can do in a couple of days. It's a pretty small place, city state. But yeah, there's a lot to see over here. I feel like for me, I came over to Asia, like, so you never met my wife Naz, right? She would already moved back by the time you guys came. So she had her student visa ran out and she had to move back to Indonesia. And I was like, oh, I bought a one-way flight. I'll go out, see what happens. And 10 years later, still haven't come back because Asia it's pretty awesome. It's pretty awesome. I think you'd love it as well. Like it just suits your personality. With just the cultures are just so different.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So
do you
different.
speak the language?
So Singapore's first language is English.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
I thought it would have been Mandarin or something.
So when Singapore was like born as a state, which was 60 years ago, so not very long, it was English, it was British, and then it went back to Malaysia. And then the guy who founded it basically realized they have no natural resources whatsoever. So their only way of being successful was to be a business hub. So he encouraged first language to be English, and now they're like the business hub of Asia. So it was a very smart move. But my wife's Indonesian. I speak a bit of Indonesian, not enough. So that's my 2020. That's one of my 2026 goals, is to pull my finger out.
Oh, nice.
Because when we get around to having kids, they'll speak Indonesian. So I need to be able to speak all the languages they do. But
it's amazing. Wow, dude, I'd love to come train. I love watching you develop. Obviously, I'll point people towards your stuff when I post this up.
Yeah, please do.
If there's anything you need in the meantime, feel free to reach out and we'll stay in contact.
I will. And I said, I keep saying to Naz that we need to get out. I can't believe I've never actually been to the US, which is pretty crazy.
Ever?
Never. I've been China, Japan, Korea, all of Asia, never been to the US. So it's definitely on the cards. And we'll definitely swing by your area when we do.
Oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely. The US is such a crazy place. It's super, it's worth seeing for sure.
Yeah.
It is wild. And there's places to go and places not to go, but definitely it's like, it is a different feel here. We'll take you and, I don't know, blow stuff up and shoot guns and wear cowboy hats or something.
The real American experience. That's what I want.
For sure. Dude, I really appreciate you taking the time. I knew I wanted to talk to you, especially seeing your development. And man, I wish you the best. We'll keep in contact. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I will do. Awesome. Nice to speak to you, dude.